Historians of Reddit, what's a devastating event that no one talks about? Galveston, Texas was once considered to be one of the most important commercial ports in the United States and was referred to by several fantastical names such as the Queen City of the Gulf and the Wall Street of the West. All that changed when it suffered a near-direct hit from a devastating Category 4 hurricane in 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Pretty much the entire city was destroyed by a storm surge and anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people died. Galveston was rebuilt but it never truly regained its status. Houston became the state's commercial center in the storm's wake, in addition to other factors. This is fairly recent, started in 1998 and ended in 2003, but the Second Congo War. It's the deadliest conflict since World War II with about 5.4 million deaths, a vast majority of them due to malnutrition and disease. Edit, glad to see this post getting so much attention. As some of you mentioned, a lot of African history is overlooked, so here are a few more 20th century African conflicts to look into if you are interested. Boer Wars, Mau Mau Uprising, Rhodesian Bush War, First and Second Liberian Civil War, Sierra Leone Civil War, Angolan Civil War, First and Second Sudanese Civil War, Somali Civil War, Eritrean Ethiopian War, Congo Crisis, Nigerian Civil War. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969, even after Hawaii officially became a state. During World War II, the Japanese had invaded the Alaskan island of Attu. On the island was the village of Attu where the Aleutian tribe had lived for centuries. The only non-natives were the wife, school teacher and priest husband, who were elderly and beloved by the townspeople. The husband was shot in front of his wife by the Japanese. After that, the Japanese loaded the native population onto ships back to Japan, where they worked in POW camps where many died from disease and execution. The Japanese saw them as lower than soldier POW and almost subhuman because they didn't fight back and thus treated them horribly. When the war ended, only a handful of the native population survived and they went back home only to find their village burned down. They left the island and it now remains uninhabited, basically, driving the Attu tribe to extinction. Years later, the Japanese left a peace monument on the island in honor of the American and Japanese soldiers that died there, but have yet to apologize to the descendants of the Attu tribe they destroyed. Baghdad used to be one of the biggest and most vibrant cities in the world in the 1200s. Until the Mongols came. Baghdad did not recover its year 1200 population until the 1980s. I'm always amazed that people know so little about Pol Pot in Cambodia. His regime killed 25% of its population. Let that sink in, 1 in 4. If you were educated, you were first killed. Cambodian genocide. They killed so many kids that the life expectancy was 18. In 535, humans went through hell. Many reported a strange color in the skies, not just in Europe. A dense, dry fog was also reported in Asia and the Middle East. Even the regions, now known as the Americas, weren't spared. For example, drought in Peru. Temperatures were rather low in some places. It snowed either in the summertime. One survivor, a Roman politician named Cassiodorus, explained about the bluish sun and no shadows being cast, even in the noon. It has been hypothesized that Iceland holds the reason for the events between the years 535 and 536. Iceland is known for its volcanoes, and it was possible one such was to blame. One thing that doesn't get talked about was more of a phenomenon or major problem than event, and that was how many people died in theater fires due to poor design, combustible materials, few fire exits, and panic. One of the worst was the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, 1903, which is both the deadliest theater fire and the deadliest single building fire in U.S. history, where patrons died after sparks from an arc light set a curtain on fire. Then a chain reaction started, exacerbated by failures of the things in place that were supposed to combat fire. The theater had been overbooked to compensate for earlier poor sales, causing some to sit blocking the exits. The fire was immediately worsened when performers opened the stage door to get outside, as it turned the fire into a fireball. Many people were held inside by iron gates that had been put in place to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. As people fled, they tumbled downstairs, trampled each other, and got squashed to death. Their unfamiliarity with the building got them stuck in dead ends and up against windows. Many jumped from fire escapes and died, while those behind them were saved, the bodies of the earlier jumpers cushioning their falls. All in all, 602 people died, many were children. The story is a lot more complicated and sordid with city corruption, etc. The one takeaway is the incident promoted the development and use of the panic bar. Sorry this is so poorly written. I was trying to write it really fast on my phone. The Andijan massacre of 2005 in Uzbekistan. It is largest mass shooting in Asia since Tiananmen Square, with over 1,000 killed and even more wounded. The Uzbek government forcefully silenced reform protests by firing into the crowd and then kicked out 90% of Westerners in the country when the US Gov and UN tried to investigate. Terrible loss of life that rarely gets remembered because the Uzbek government tried so hard to cover it up. Edit, I know this because my family was one of the many permanently kicked out, when I was 2 years old. Taiping Heavenly Kingdom of Hongshochuan. Put simply, it was an usurped kingdom in 1850s China that directly and indirectly led to the deaths of millions, maybe 10 million plus, of people through massacre and famine. Hong Shou-Chuen believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and persuaded enough people to follow along and start a civil war. Check out God's Chinese Son by Jonathan Spence. I'm not really a proper historian, but I feel the need to mention the Bronze Age collapse. It's not as though nobody talks about it at all, but considering how catastrophic it was, it doesn't get nearly enough attention. At this time civilizations were still pretty scarce, but the Eastern Mediterranean was full of them. We can't pinpoint an exact reason, but at some point it all fell apart. The Mycenaeans? Gone. The Hittites? Gone. The Minoans? Gone. The Egyptians? Barely clinging on and having serious problems. There are many things that happened around that time in that general area that could be the culprit: volcanoes, earthquakes, drought, famine, war, and invasions from foreigners that came by boat that historians have named the Sea People because we have basically no idea where they came from. In reality, it was probably a combination of some or even all of them. Again, I'm not a proper historian by any means, but this is what I heard. Actual historians, feel free to correct any mistakes or mention something I missed. The Bronze Age collapse. Arguably more devastating than the fall of the West Roman Empire. So much knowledge lost. Truly one of history's great mysteries. I recommend reading up on it. It's really interesting. The Highland clearances. Over a period of about 150 years between the 18th and 19th centuries, English and lowland Scottish landlords evicted thousands upon thousands of Highland Scots from their ancestral homelands and replaced them with sheep. It's hard to classify as a historical event because it went on for so long and is usually interpreted as an ambiguous series of largely isolated incidents. There were attacks on villages in which the landlords would burn their tenants' houses to the ground to get them to leave, and burn their land so that nothing could grow. Multiple people were caught in the fires and died. During the Glencoe massacre, 30 members of Clan MacDonald were murdered by Scottish government forces for supporting the Jacobite uprising. The Irish potato famine also affected the Highland Scots who grew potatoes, and many people starved or were forced to leave as well. As a result, there was a series of mass migration in which Scots traveled to Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the US, and largely lost their language and culture. It's very sad, and all that is basically why Highland culture and language has largely been lost. The disease outbreaks that hit the Americas with the arrival of the Europeans. You hear about a 90% death rate and it sounds made up, but whatever the actual number was, entire civilizations were literally wiped out. Cultures that had existed for thousands of years are just gone, with barely a record left. You have stories of people coming across whole villages of corpses. These people died never even having seen the Europeans, never knowing what was killing them and their loved ones, and totally helpless to do anything about it. Asked my history studying friend about this, she said there's a lot of events that people don't talk about. For example, there was a lot of countries involved in the Balkan conflict who knew about the massacre of Srebrenica but still allowed it to happen. So many historical events are just so grim and depressing when you read about it. We knew bad things were happening but didn't stop until it was too late for many people.